Clarence spent years convincing Juanita that she was just a shadow he owned, a woman who would vanish if he ever stopped watching, until she sat beside a man who looked at her like she was the most valuable asset in the city he already ruled. The bus hummed with a low mechanical vibration that rattled Juanita's teeth. She huddled into her bright yellow sweater, her fingers trembling as she white-knuckled the strap of her bag. Tucked into the corner of the seat, she tried to shrink, to disappear into the cracked leather, to become invisible to the world. The reflection in the window was a horror story she had lived through. The stark white bandage over her right eye stood out like a beacon against her dark skin, hiding the latest mark of Clarence's devotion. She scanned the other passengers, ordinary people bathed in the harsh, flickering bus light. Some looked with a fleeting wince of pity. Most simply stared at their phones, pretending she didn't exist. This was the isolation Clarence had mastered. He had hollowed her out, whispering that because she had no one else to turn to, her screams would always fall on deaf ears. Her heart hammered against her chest like a frantic animal. Every time the bus hissed to a stop at a dark intersection, she flinched, expecting Clarence's bearded face to appear in the glass. She could still smell the stale whiskey on his breath, and hear the way he roared that she belonged to him. She was a woman running on fumes, her expressive eyes wide with the hyper-vigilance that had become her second skin. Beside her, the air felt different, cold, still, and heavy with the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. She didn't dare look at the man in the blue suit, but she could see the intricate ink on his rolled-up sleeves out of the corner of her eye. She was a runaway, a survivor of a systematic war, desperately hoping this bus was taking her to a life where Clarence Caldwell was just a bad memory. But as the bus doors groaned open at the next stop, the cold realization hit her. The war wasn't over. It was just changing fronts. The bus was a fluorescent-lit cage rattling to the veins of a city that didn't care if Juanita K. Fuller lived or died. She pressed her shoulder against the vibrating window, trying to merge with the glass. Every bump in the road sent a jolt of white-hot terror through her chest, making the bandage over her right eye throb with a rhythmic, punishing heat. Inside her mind, the walls were still collapsing. She could still hear the sickening thud of Clarence's fist against the doorframe, the roar of his voice promising that she would never find a corner of this earth dark enough to hide in. She was a ghost in a yellow sweater, clutching her bag like a life preserver in a black sea. Her breathing was shallow, a series of jagged hitches that barely reached her lungs. To her left, the city blurred into a smear of neon and shadow, but it was a presence to her right that began to pull her out of her internal spiral. The air in the seat next to her didn't just feel occupied. It felt heavy. It was a dense, gravitational pull that commanded the oxygen in the immediate radius. Juanita didn't dare turn her head, but she could see him in the periphery of her good eye. He was a mountain of tailored blue wool and silent, terrifying intent. He didn't move with the rhythm of the bus. He sat with an unnatural, predatory stillness that made Clarence's explosive rage feel small and amateurish. Out of the corner of her eye, she traced the ink that crawled down his forearms where the sleeves of his crisp white shirt were rolled back. The tattoos were a dark, intricate map of things she couldn't understand. Beasts with bared teeth and geometric lines that looked like iron bars. His hands were huge, resting casually on his thighs, but even in repose, his knuckles looked like they were carved from granite. He smelled of cold cedar and a high-end tobacco that didn't belong on a crosstown bus at 2 a.m. Juanita felt a new kind of cold seep into her bones. She had spent 5 years learning to read the air for the coming storm of man's temper, but this man, Baldo Perazzi, was a storm. He was the deep, crushing pressure of the ocean floor. He didn't look at her, yet she felt seen in a way that made her skin prickle. She was caught between a man she was running from and a man who looked like he owned the very pavement the bus was rolling over. Her internal breakdown stalled, replaced by a crystalline, shimmering fear. She had jumped from a burning building, only to realize she was falling toward a lion's den. As the bus slowed for the next stop, the hiss of the air brakes sounded like a warning. Juanita closed her eyes, praying for the dark, but the Stone King beside her didn't even blink. The bus doors groaned open with a hiss that sounded like a final judgment. For a heartbeat, there was only the low idle of the engine and the distant siren of a city that never slept. Then the metal steps shuddered under a heavy, frantic weight. Clarence Caldwell exploded into the carriage, his green field jacket damp with sweat and his eyes bloodshot with manic, possessive hunger. He didn't look at the driver or the shivering passengers. He looked only for the yellow sweater. When his gaze landed on Juanita, a jagged, terrifying grin split his bearded face. "Found you," he roared. The smell of stale whiskey and unhinged rage preceded him like a physical blow. Juanita's world narrowed to a pinprick of white light. She tried to push herself further into window, her fingers clawing at the glass, her breath coming in panicked, broken gasps. The public, a collection of weary night shift workers and drifters, collectively held their breath. They looked at their laps, at the floor, at the ceiling. Anywhere but the woman about to be unmade. Mac Joel, the transit officer on the far right, took a tentative step forward, his hand hovering over his vest, but the sheer, explosive violence radiating from Clarence made him hesitate. "Get up!" Clarence screamed, reaching across the aisle. His hand, thick and calloused, clamped onto Juanita's wrist with the force of a leg iron. "You think you can just leave? You're mine, Juanita. We're going home." He yanked her toward the aisle. Juanita let out a strangled sob, her feet skidding on the grimy floor, her free hand still clutching her bag as if it were her last shred of dignity. The bandage over her eye began to soak through with fresh tears. Clarence was a landslide, a force of nature she had never been able to stop. He began to drag her toward the exit, his face contorted in a triumph that was far more frightening than his anger. But as he tried to pull her past a man in the blue suit, the momentum of the world stopped. Baldo Perazzi hadn't moved a muscle, yet Clarence suddenly found himself unable to pull Juanita an inch further. The tattooed man hadn't even looked up, but his presence had become an invisible wall. The carriage went deathly silent, the only sound the frantic thudding of Juanita's heart. Clarence's grip tightened, his knuckles whitening, but he found his arm barred by a sleeve of dark blue wool and a hand that looked like it was forged in an iron foundry. The breach had happened, and for the first time in 5 years, the predator wasn't the most dangerous thing in the room. The air in the bus curdled, turning thick and heavy as a man in the royal blue suit finally moved. It was an explosion of violence. It was a slow, terrifying shift of a tectonic plate. Baldo Perazzi didn't stand up immediately. He simply uncrossed his legs and turned his head. His eyes, dark and as cold as a winter sea, locked onto Clarence's face. The grip Clarence had on Juanita's wrist faltered, his fingers twitching as the sheer weight of Baldo's gaze pressed into him. "Release her," Baldo said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the floorboards of the bus, carrying the absolute authority of a man who had never had to ask for anything twice. The tattoos on his arm seemed to pulse in the flickering overhead lights, the dragons and geometric jagged lines framing his clenched fist like a warning. Clarence blinked, his chest heaving, his face turning a blotchy, panicked red. This is family business." "You don't know who I am," he spat, though his voice cracked at the edges. He tried to reclaim his bravado, pointing a trembling finger at Juanita, but his feet were already betraying him. Shuffling a cautious inch backward, Baldo stood then, and the bus seemed to shrink around him. He didn't raise his hands to strike. He simply occupied the space Clarence thought he owned. He moved into the aisle, a wall of navy wool and ink, placing himself directly between the predator and the prey. Mac Joel, the officer, stood frozen on the periphery, his hand falling away from his holster as he realized he was no longer the highest authority on this vehicle. The passengers were motionless, a gallery of statues witnessing the moment a god stepped onto a mortal plane. "I know exactly who you are," Baldo replied, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a blade against Clarence's throat. "You are a man who has confused silence for permission. That mistake ends tonight." Baldo took a single step forward. He didn't reach for Clarence, but the shift in gravity was enough. Clarence's eyes went wide, reflecting a sudden, primal realization that he was standing in the path of the city's most efficient monster. The whiskey-fueled rage evaporated, replaced by a cold, soaking terror. He stumbled back, his boots scuffing the floor as he scrambled toward the open doors. He didn't look back at Juanita. He didn't scream another threat. He simply vanished into the night, the hiss of the bus doors closing behind him like the snapping of a trap. In the sudden, ringing silence, Juanita remained huddled against a window, her breath coming in ragged, disbelieving gasps. The Stone King didn't look at the fleeing man. He turned back to her, his shadow falling over her yellow sweater, and for the first time in 5 years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a fortress. The bus moved on, a hollow shell of metal echoing with the ghost of Clarence's screams. But for Juanita, the world had slowed to the rhythm of the man standing over her. Baldo didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer a hand. He simply waited for her to stand, his presence a silent command that she was no longer permitted to cower. When she finally rose, her legs feeling like sun-bleached straw, he led her off the bus at a stop that looked like nowhere and everywhere at once. A fleet of black SUVs sat idling at the curb, their headlights cutting through the city's haze like searchlights. The drive was a blur of tinted glass and high-speed turns. Juanita sat in the back seat, the yellow of her sweater stark against the plush black leather. Beside her, Baldo remained a statue of navy wool, staring out at the passing streetlights. He didn't speak, but the air between them was electric, with a new kind of tension. She wasn't being kidnapped, yet she didn't feel free. She felt like a bird that had flown out a storm and into a cathedral. The ceiling was higher, but the walls were just as thick. They finally pulled through a set of massive iron gates that looked like they belonged to a fortress rather than a home. The gravel crunched under the tires as they ascended a winding driveway toward a sprawling estate of cold stone and sharp angles. Men in dark suits stood at every corner, their earpieces glinting under the moon. They didn't look at Juanita. They bowed their heads as Baldo stepped out to see, as she followed him into the foyer. The sheer scale of the wealth hit her, like a physical weight. Marble floors stretched out under crystal chandeliers, and the walls were lined with portraits of stern-faced men, with the same cold, predatory eyes as Baldo. It was only when she saw the crest carved into grand fireplace, a crown entwined with serpent, that the blood drained from her face. She heard the name whispered in the darkest corners of the city, a name that meant both absolute order and absolute violence. Perazzi. Juanita stopped in the center of the hall, her small bag clutched to her chest. She looked at the man who had stood between her and Clarence. Seeing the ink on his arms in the brilliant light of the mansion, he wasn't just a stranger on a bus. He was a Stone King, the heir to an empire built on the very law of silence she had only ever known as a threat. She had escaped a man who thought he was a god, only to be taken in by the man who actually was one. Baldo turned, his gaze sweeping over her bandaged face, and for the first time, the gravity of her new reality settled into her bones. She wasn't at a shelter. She was in the heart of the serpent's nest. The guest suite was a silent expanse of silk and shadow, far removed from the peeling wallpaper and the sound of Clarence's pacing that had defined Juanita's life for 5 years. She sat on the edge of a bed that felt too soft to be safe, her small bag resting on a velvet chair like a piece of debris from a shipwreck. The air in the Perazzi estate didn't circulate. It weighed. It was a heavy, expensive stillness that made the ringing in her ears louder. She kept her yellow sweater on, the wool scratchy against her skin, a final layer of the woman she used to be. Every time a floorboard groaned or the wind brushed against the reinforced glass, she flinched, her hand instinctively flying to the bandage over her eye. Thirst eventually drove her from the room. She moved through the corridors like a ghost, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. The house was a museum of power, lit by dim, recessed lights that made the shadows look like they had teeth. As she reached the landing of the great staircase, a figure stepped out from the darkness of a side gallery. Juanita froze, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. It wasn't Baldo. It was a man from the bus, the officer in the tactical vest. Up close, without the flickering lights of the transit line, Ezio Palermo looked tired. His uniform was rumpled, and his eyes carried the weary cynicism of a man who had seen too much of the city's underbelly to believe in fairy tales. "He's in the study," Ezio said, his voice a low rasp that broke the oppressive quiet. He didn't move toward her, but his presence was a blockade. "If you're looking for a way out, the gates are biometric. You aren't leaving unless he decides the sun should rise for you." Juanita swallowed hard, her throat tight. "He saved me," she whispered, the words feeling fragile in the vast hall. Ezio let out a short, mirthless sound that might have been a laugh. He leaned against a marble pillar, his gaze sweeping over her bandaged face with a mixture of pity and warning. "Baldo Perazzi doesn't save people, Juanita. He collects them." In his world, everything has a placement and a purpose. You weren't a passenger to him. You were a disruption he decided to resolve. He stepped closer, the light catching the police patch on his vest, a badge that felt meaningless inside these stone walls. Don't mistake his shadow for a sanctuary. Clarence was a small fire, easy to stomp out, but the man downstairs? He's the furnace. You traded a prison for a fortress, but make no mistake, the walls are just as high. He turned to leave, disappearing back into the shadows before she could find the words to argue. Juanita stood alone in the hallway, the luxury of the estate suddenly feeling as cold as a tomb. She looked down at the dark foyer below, wondering if the Stone King was protecting her from the world, or if he was simply making sure the world couldn't get to his latest acquisition. The dawn didn't break over Barazzi estate. It simply bled into the room, a cold, gray light that offered no warmth. Juanita found Baldo in a room that smelled of ink and ancient dust, a library where the books stood like soldiers in the gloom. He was already awake, standing by a floor-to-ceiling window, his suit jacket discarded and his white shirt sleeves rolled tight against his tattooed forearms. He didn't turn when she entered, yet he spoke the moment her foot touched the rug. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't an invitation, it was a placement. Juanita sat in a high-back leather chair that felt like a throne for someone much larger. She felt small in her yellow sweater, her fingers picking at a loose thread. Baldo finally turned, his gaze dropping to her restless hands. He walked toward her with a measured, predatory grace, stopping only when his shadow completely eclipsed her. "In the world you left behind, noise was power," Baldo said, his voice a low, resonant hum. Clarence screamed to feel big. He roared because he was terrified that if he stopped making sound, he would disappear. He is a man who bleeds through his mouth. He leaned down, his large, tattooed hands gripping the arms of her chair, pinning her in place. The scent of cold cedar and tobacco was overwhelming. Here, noise is a weakness. The man who shouts has already lost the advantage. He has told the enemy exactly where he is and how much he hurts. He reached out, his thumb hovering just inches from the bandage over her eye. Only the silent are safe. Juanita, silence is not a lack of words. It is a lack of vulnerability. He pulled back, walking to a desk and sliding a heavy, silver-plated fountain pen toward her. Clarence used your history to break you. He used your lack of family to tell you that you were a ghost. From today, you will use that invisibility as your armor. If the world cannot find you, it cannot touch you. He watched her, his dark eyes assessing her like a grandmaster studying a new piece on the board. He wasn't comforting her. He was retooling her. He began to speak of the city not as a place of people, but as a grid of influence, of whispers, and of calculated absences. As he spoke, Juanita felt the first shift in her own internal architecture. He was treating her not as a victim to be shielded, but as an apprentice to be forged. For the first time, she didn't look at the floor. She looked at the ink on his skin, realizing that if she learned to speak his language of silence, she might finally become the ghost Clarence was so afraid of. The courtyard at the center of the estate was a well of shadows where the morning air clung to stone like a damp shroud. In the center, a bronze brazier flickered with a low, hungry flame. Baldo stood by the edge of the heat, his hands deep in his trouser pockets, watching the orange light dance across the geometric ink on his wrists. He didn't look at Juanita as she approached, but the air shifted, acknowledging her arrival. In her hands, she carried the yellow sweater. It felt heavier than it ever had, a knit shroud of every flinch, every muffled sob, and every mile spent running in the dark. It was the color of a target. It was the color of a girl who hoped that if she were bright enough, someone might see her and save her. "The things we carry are often the things that tether us to our predators," Baldo said, his voice a low vibration against the morning quiet. "You cannot walk into a new life wearing the skin of the person who was hunted." Juanita looked down at the wool. It was frayed at the cuffs where she had chewed on it during Clarence's long nights of drinking. With a trembling breath, she stepped forward and dropped it into the brazier. The flames hesitated for a second before greedily catching the fabric. The smell of burning wool rose in a thick, acrid cloud, the scent of 5 years of misery finally turning to ash. As the bright yellow blackened and curled into nothing, Juanita felt a strange, terrifying lightness in her chest. The target was gone. She followed Baldo back inside to a room where the air was crisp and smelled of new silk and leather. On the long mahogany table sat a new wardrobe. There were no bright colors here. No soft knits design make a person look smaller. Instead, there were structured blazers with sharp, reinforced shoulders, silk blouses the color of midnight, and tailored trousers that felt like armor. Juanita reached out, her fingers brushing a charcoal gray jacket. The fabric was cool and firm, offering a silhouette that didn't shrink or apologetically take up less space. She shed her old clothes, the last remnants of Juanita the victim, and stepped into the uniform of the Perazzi family. When she looked in the mirror, the woman staring back was a stranger. The white bandage over her eye remained, but beneath it, her jaw was set, and the sharp lines of the dark suit made her look like a shadow that had finally found its teeth. She was no longer a splash of color in a gray world. She was the darkness itself. Beside her reflection, Baldo's silhouette appeared in the glass. He didn't offer a compliment, but the slight nod of his head was the only confirmation she needed. The hunted was gone. The shadow had begun to rise. The city outside the Perazzi gates didn't stop for Juanita's transformation, but for Clarence Caldwell, the world had shrunk to a single, jagged obsession. In a cramped basement apartment that smelled of desperation and sour sweat, Clarence stared at a wall covered in frantic, hand-drawn notes and blurry printouts. He no longer looked like the man who had boarded that bus with the swagger of a king. He was a skeletal version of himself, his skin sallow and his beard matted with the grime of a man who had forgotten how to sleep. The man in the suit was a ghost that haunted every corner of Clarence's mind. He had lost his job at the warehouse 3 days after the bus incident. His supervisor had tired of the erratic outbursts and the way Clarence spent his shifts staring at the security feeds instead of the freight. But Clarence didn't care about the paycheck. He cared only about the blue wool, the ink-stained arms, and the way the stranger looked through him as if he were made of glass. He spent his nights prowling the transit lines, boarding bus after bus at 2 a.m., his eyes darting frantically between every passenger. He had become a familiar, terrifying fixture of the night, a muttering shadow that smelled of cheap rye and of violence that was looking for a home. He stopped men in suits on the street, grabbing their lapels and demanding to know where he was, only to be shoved into the gutter or ignored like a stray dog. His obsession was a fever that burned away his reason. He convinced himself that Juanita hadn't been saved, but stolen. In his warped reality, he was still the hero of a story where his property had been taken by a bigger thief. He began to sell what little he owned, his television, his tools, even the furniture they had shared, to buy information from the bottom feeders of the city's docks. He didn't realize that every question he asked was a ripple in a very deep, very dangerous pond. He didn't know that the Perazzi name was a word people didn't say out loud to men like him. As he sat in the dark, clutching a crumpled transit map, Clarence's mind finally fractured. He began to hear Baldo's voice in the hum of the refrigerator, a low, resonant vibration that mocked him. He wasn't hunting a man anymore. He was hunting a shadow that had already swallowed his life whole. He was a cornered animal, and as the last of his sanity evaporated, he turned his gaze toward the only thing he had left, a lead on a black SUV and a name that started with a P. He was walking into a furnace, convinced he was a fire. The basement of the Perazzi estate was not a cellar, but a vault of polished concrete and reinforced steel, echoing with a rhythmic, distant thud of lead hitting paper. Baldo stood at the far end of the firing range, his blue suit jacket discarded, his white shirt glowing against the industrial dimness. On the table between them lay a piece of machinery that looked too heavy for the world Juanita had come from, a sleek, matte black handgun that seemed to drink the light. "Pick it up," Baldo said. Juanita hesitated. Her hands, once accustomed only to the frantic grip of her own bag or the shielding of her face, felt fragile. She reached out, her fingers brushing the cold, textured grip. It was heavier than she expected, a dense weight that tugged at her wrist. "Don't hold it like a victim." Baldo's voice was a low vibration at her ear as he stepped up behind her. He didn't touch her, yet his presence acted as a brace for her spine. A weapon is not a miracle. It is a period at the end of a sentence. It is the final word when silence is no longer enough. He reached around her, his large, tattooed hands guiding hers. He didn't take the weight from her. He corrected her alignment. He showed her how to wrap her fingers, so the steel became an extension of her bone. Juanita felt the heat radiating from him, the steady, unbothered rhythm of his heart against her shoulder. "You aren't holding this to kill a man today," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the target downrange. "You are holding it to understand that your hands are no longer meant for begging. Feel the weight, Juanita. That is the weight of a choice. That is the weight of the space between you and anyone who thinks they can touch you without permission." Juanita gripped the weapon tighter. The cold steel began to warm against her palm. For 5 years, her hands had been tools of frantic defense, clumsy and weak under Clarence's shadow. Now, she felt the mechanical precision of the tool in her grasp. It was a terrifying, crystalline sensation. She wasn't looking at a gun. She was looking at the physical manifestation of her own agency. "Your power doesn't come from the trigger," Baldo said, stepping back and leaving her to stand on her own. "It comes from the knowledge that you could pull it. The weapon is just a punctuation. You are the author." Juanita stood in the silence of the vault, the dark suit of her new life, making her a shadow against the concrete. She didn't fire. She simply stood there, breathing in the scent of oil and cold air, finally feeling the heavy, solid truth that she was no longer the one waiting for the blow to fall. She was the one holding the end of the story. The night was a velvet curtain of rain and engine hum as the black SUV pulled up the curb of a glass-and-steel skyscraper that pierced the city's low clouds. Juanita sat in the back, her new charcoal gray suit fitting her like a second skin, sharp and unforgiving. She had replaced a bandage over her eye with a sleek, dark medical patch that looked less like an injury and more like a mask. Beside her, Baldo was a masterpiece of cold elegance, his blue suit perfectly pressed, his tattooed wrists hidden beneath French cuffs. "Tonight is not about eating," Baldo said, his voice a low vibration that barely rose above the sound of the rain. "It is about the geography of the room. You do not look for the exit. You look for the eyes that turn away when you enter. Those are the people who fear us." As they stepped into the private dining room at the summit of the tower, the air changed. The clink of crystal and the low murmur of conversation died a sudden, synchronized death. The men seated around the long mahogany table were the architects of the city's shadows, brokers of flesh, steel, and silence. They were predators who had spent decades carving out territories. Yet as Baldo walked ahead of the table, they stood. Juanita felt the weight of a dozen gazes, each one a sharp, calculating blade. In her old life, this much attention would have sent her into a blind panic, her knees buckling under the pressure of being seen. But tonight, she felt the phantom weight of the weapon she had held in the vault. She felt the structured shoulders of her jacket holding her spine straight. Baldo didn't pull out a chair for her at the side of the room. He pulled out the chair directly to his right, the seat of the consort, the advisor, the successor. "Gentlemen," Baldo said, his voice echoing in the sudden vacuum of the room. He didn't introduce her by her history. He didn't mention her escape or her wounds. "This is Juanita. Her word carries the weight of my own. Treat it with the appropriate gravity." A heavy, stunned silence followed. Juanita realized then that she wasn't being presented as a refugee seeking shelter. She was being positioned as a pillar of the Perazzi Empire. These men weren't looking at a victim. They were looking at a woman who had been hand-forged by the Stone King himself. She looked down the table, her good eye locking onto a man who had been staring too long. He was the first to look away. In that moment, the last fragment of the woman on the bust dissolved. She wasn't a guest in this underworld. She was becoming its queen, a shadow rising to sit beside the dragon, realizing that the highest form of safety wasn't hiding from the monsters. It was becoming the one they feared most. The city's belly was a place of damp concrete and desperate transactions, and for Clarence, it had finally yielded a name. He sat in the back of a neon-drenched diner, the air thick with the smell of burnt grease and cigarette ash. Across from him sat a man whose face was a map of insignificance, a witness who had been on the bus that night, a passenger who hadn't looked away, but had instead watched the black SUVs with the calculated greed of a scavenger. The man leaned in, his voice a greasy whisper that barely rose above the hum of the cooling fans. "I followed them," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the door. "I saw where they went. It's the fortress on the hill, the one with the iron gates, and the guards who look like they're made of stone. The Perazzi place." Clarence's hand, shaking with a cocktail withdrawal and adrenaline, gripped his coffee mug so hard the ceramic groaned. The name Perazzi meant nothing to a man who had already lost his soul. It was just a wall standing between him and his property. He didn't see the danger. He didn't see the furnace. He only saw the destination. He slid a crumpled wad of bills across the table, the last of his savings, the price of his own funeral, and watched the trader disappear into the rain. The clock began to tick, a heavy, rhythmic pulse that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the city. Clarence wasn't just a man anymore. He was a fuse that had been lit, burning toward a powder keg he didn't understand. He spent the next hour in a hardware store, his movements jerky and frantic, buying lengths of heavy chain and a jagged, serrated blade. He was preparing for a war he had already lost, driven by a madness that told him he could still win. Inside the Perazzi villa, the silence was absolute, but the air was beginning to vibrate with a premonition of violence. Baldo sat in his study, his gaze fixed on a security monitor that flickered with a sudden, anomalous movement at the edge of the perimeter. He didn't call for his men. He didn't reach for his coat. He simply watched the screen, his tattooed fingers drumming a slow, patient beat on the mahogany desk. The breach was coming. The scavenger had spoken, and the predator was waiting. The piece Juanita had found was a fragile glass dome, and outside, in the dark and the rain, the first crack was starting to spread. The hunt was no longer a shadow. It was a collision course. The rain didn't fall so much as it besieged the estate, a relentless, silver onslaught that turned the manicured grounds into a blurred wasteland of mud and moving shadows. Inside the villa, the power didn't flicker. The Perazzi empire was built on redundancies. Instead, the air simply grew heavy with the ionized scent of an approaching strike. Juanita stood by the vast window of the upper gallery, her dark suit blending into mahogany paneling, her good eye fixed on the perimeter where the forest met the iron gates. Down at the gatehouse, Ezio Palermo sat his patrol car, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. The blue and red lights of his dash were dark. He watched through the rain as a battered, unmarked van skidded to a halt near the stone wall. Figures emerged, men who looked like jagged remnants of the city's worst alleys, led by a man whose movements were fueled by a terrifying, frantic energy. It was Clarence. He was a ghost of a man, draped in a soaked field jacket, clutching a length of heavy chain as if it were a scepter. Ezio reached for his radio, his thumb hovering over the transmit button. He looked at the gate, then at the shadow of the villa, sitting on the hill like a sleeping dragon. He remembered the look in Baldo's eyes on the bus, the absolute, crushing certainty of his power. He remembered Juanita's bandaged face. Slowly, with a deliberate, weary motion, Ezio pulled his hand away. He turned his gaze toward the dark dashboard, reached out, and clicked off his body camera. The law didn't just step aside, it went blind. In a city of monsters, Ezio had decided which one he would rather owe a favor. The first crack of the breach was the sound of a heavy sledgehammer meeting the biometric lock. It was a small, pathetic noise against the roar of the storm, but it was enough. Clarence and his desperate crew poured through the gap, their boots churning the gravel into filth. They ran toward the lights of the house, screaming into the wind, a chorus of the forgotten trying to storm the heavens. Juanita didn't flinch as the first alarm began to chime, a low, melodic pulse that signaled the outer perimeter had failed. She didn't run for a panic room. She turned away from the window and walked toward the grand staircase, her hand brushing the railing with a steady, unhurried grace. She could hear the heavy thud of the front doors being battered, the chaotic shouts of men who thought they were bringing a storm. She knew better. The storm wasn't coming from outside. It was waiting in the foyer, dressed in navy wool and ink, and for the first time in her life, Juanita wasn't afraid of the lightning. She was part of it. The grand foyer was a cathedral of marble and waiting silence, illuminated by the cold, steady glow of the crystal chandeliers. When the massive front doors finally groaned and splintered inward, the violence that spilled was messy, frantic, and soaked in rain. Clarence stumbled over the threshold, his boots skidding on the polished floor, his chest heaving as he brandished a jagged blade like a desperate holy relic. Behind him, his crew of shadows hesitated, their eyes darting toward the dark corners of the hall, sensing the trap before they saw it. Clarence didn't look at the architecture. He didn't see the parazzi guards flanking the upper gallery like gargoyles. His bloodshot eyes locked onto the figure standing at the base of the twin staircases. Juanita didn't move. She stood in the center of the hall, her charcoal gray suit sharp enough to cut the air. The medical patch over her eye was a dark, defiant seal, and her hands hung loosely at her sides. She looked like she had been born from the stone itself. "I came for you," Clarence screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed off the high ceiling. He took a staggering step forward, the rain from his field jacket pooling on the pristine marble. "You're coming home, Juanita. I don't care who this guy is. You're mine." In her old life, those words would have been a cage. They would have turned her bones to water and her breath to a plea. But as she looked at him, Juanita realized with shimmering, crystalline clarity that the monster was gone. The man before her was small. He was a collection of loud noises and cheap whiskey, a hollow shell trying to command a ghost that no longer existed. "I am home, Clarence," she said. Her voice was a low, steady current that cut right through his frantic energy. It carried the weight of the law of silence Baldo had carved into her soul. She didn't shout. She didn't tremble. She simply occupied her space with a terrifying, absolute stillness. Clarence stopped, his knife hand wavering. He looked for the flinch, the tear, the frantic clutching of her bag, the target he knew how to hit. He found nothing. The woman standing before him was a stranger who looked at him not with fear, but with the cold, clinical observation of a predator deciding if the prey was worth the effort. "You're nothing without me," he hissed, but the conviction was leaking out of him, replaced by a primal, soaking dread. Juanita took a single step forward. The movement was so calm, so deliberate, that Clarence instinctively recoiled. "You spent 5 years telling me I was a ghost, Clarence. You were right. And ghosts aren't afraid of the dark." From the shadows of the landing above, the click of a lighter sparked. Baldo appeared, the flame illuminating the ink on his hand for a brief, lethal second before he vanished back into the gloom. He didn't intervene. He didn't have to. The power in the room had already shifted. And for the first time, Clarence realized he hadn't broken into a house. He had broken into a tomb. The silence in the foyer was heavier than the storm outside, a suffocating pressure that seemed to strip Clarence of his air. He stood in the center of the marble floor, his serrated blade trembling in a hand that had once felt like an iron vice to Juanita. He looked at her, searching for crack in her composure, the familiar quiver of her lip that usually signaled his victory. But Juanita remained an immovable pillar of charcoal silk and cold intent. "You're an orphan, Juanita," Clarence spat, his voice sounding thin and hollow against the vaulted ceiling. "You've got no one. Without this fancy house and this man hiding in the dark, you're a ghost. You're nothing." It was the ultimate weapon in his arsenal, the orphan complex he had spent 5 years sharpening to keep her tethered to his shadow. In the past, those words would have been a killing blow. But as they hit the air now, Juanita felt a strange, shimmering sense of detachment. She didn't feel the sting of the insult. She felt the desperation behind it. She looked at the grime under his fingernails, the frantic twitch in his jaw, and the way his oversized jacket hung off his narrow shoulders. She realized then that Clarence hadn't ever been a giant. He was a small, broken man who had only looked large because he had forced her to live on her knees. "I am an orphan, Clarence," she said, her voice a calm, resonant current that didn't waver. "And being an orphan means I learned a long time ago how to build a world out of nothing. I'm not a ghost because I'm invisible to you. I'm a ghost because I finally passed through the walls of the prison you built." She took another step toward him, closing the distance until she was well within the reach of his blade. Clarence recoiled, his heels clicking frantically against the marble. He raised a knife, but his arm felt leaden, overmatched by the absolute gravity of her presence. From the darkness of the landing above, the orange ember of Baldo's cigar glowed for a brief second, a silent witness, a dragon watching its fledgling take flight. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The authority in the room belonged entirely to the woman in the gray suit. "The man on the bus didn't save me from you, Clarence," Juanita whispered, her gaze locking onto his with a terrifying clinical stillness. "He just gave me the silence I needed to realize I didn't need saving. You can go now. Or you can stay and find out what happens when a ghost stops being afraid." Clarence looked up at the shadows where Baldo waited, then back at the woman he no longer recognized. The knife slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the marble with a pathetic, tinny ring. He was a hollow shell, a predator who had finally realized the woods were no longer his. He didn't fight. He didn't roar. He simply collapsed inward, a small, shivering man who had finally run out of noise. The removal of Clarence was not an execution, but an erasure. At a single, silent nod from Baldo, the shadows of the foyer materialized into men who moved with the clinical efficiency of a machine. They didn't strike him. They simply gathered him up, a discarded remnant of a past that no longer had a place in the Perazzi record. Clarence didn't fight. He was let out into the rain, his muttering voice swallowed by the roar of the storm until he was nothing more than a fading taillight in the dark. Juanita stood alone in the center of the hall, the silence rushing back in to fill the space he had occupied. She felt the heavy, solid weight of the marble beneath her feet, and for the first time in her life, the floor didn't feel like it was shifting. The air was clear, stripped of the scent of sour whiskey and fear. She felt the shift in the atmosphere before she heard his footsteps. Baldo descended the stairs, his movements as fluid and certain as a predator in his own domain. He stopped beside her, his presence a wall of cold cedar and gravity. He didn't offer a platitude. He didn't ask her how she felt. He simply turned toward the grand terrace doors and walked, a silent invitation for her to follow him into the height of the night. They stepped out onto the balcony, high above the city. The storm had broken, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and a million flickering lights that looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The rain-slicked streets far below glowed with the amber streetlights, a sprawling map of influence and secrets. Juanita leaned against the cold stone railing, her dark suit a sharp silhouette against the city's glow. She adjusted the dark patch over her eye, not as a concealment of shame, but as a mark of rank. Beside her, Baldo rested his tattooed forearms on the stone, his gaze fixed on a horizon where the docks met the sea. "The city is loud," Baldo said, his voice a low vibration that belonged to the wind. "But from here, it is only as loud as you allow it to be." Juanita looked out at the lights. She thought of the woman in the yellow sweater, the one who had boarded a bus to nowhere with a heart full of broken glass. That woman was gone, burned away in the brazier and buried under the weight of the Stone King's lessons. She was no longer a refugee or a student. She was a woman who had learned that peace was not something found in a hiding place. It was something built with iron and silence. She looked at Baldo, and he met her gaze with a rare, infinitesimal tilt of his head, a recognition between equals. She wasn't standing in his shadow. She was standing beside the dragon, looking out at a kingdom she helped govern. Juanita Kay. Fuller drew in a breath of the cold, clean air, finally the architect of her own sanctuary, ruling the silence she had once feared.